Not many individuals are willing to bring it up in conversation because doing so makes them easy targets. One of my primary questions is this: how can one do the right thing even when they are well aware that they will encounter tremendous resistance? Daystar never intended to reveal that secret. Something new has just surfaced for you to view. Shocking information from a recently unearthed letter by Rebecca Lamb and her husband JW directly disputed Joni Lamb's public story. Not a rumor. The story comes straight from the Lamb family's own records. Also, its contents may make you reevaluate your views on Dyer's leadership style. The truth can't be concealed any longer as the walls close in. Joni Lamb repeatedly denied the existence of any proof against Pete while appearing before television cameras. In her public speeches, interviews, and broadcasts, articulate, self-assured, and unafraid. It seemed final to those who were rooting for her. Given the absence of evidence, there was no case. It was not possible to brush off the accusations as animosity or falsehoods in any instance. Suddenly, though, a letter, and not just any letter, came to light. The source of this one was within her own family. Jonathan Weiss, who was married to her daughter Rebecca and her son-in-law, was the author. Everything it detailed ran counter to Joni's neat and tidy account. Had been revealing. None of those things applied here. It was more than just an intuition or anecdotal evidence. JW recorded the events as he had witnessed them firsthand. Rebecca and he had stopped by. Observations of Pete's conduct were made towards the little girl who lived with Jonathan and Suz, which caused them great distress. Those who have read the letter say it lays out specific instances when Pete's behaviors were inappropriate. Inappropriate physical touch and displays of affection that no mature adult could turn a blind eye to. This is of the utmost importance. Joni's entire case against Pete was based on the assumption that Susie and Jonathan were the only ones who had issues with him. She portrayed them as radicals, the only ones voiced their opinions for reasons other than reality. That's the reason JW's remarks hurt so much. If a different relative, particularly one, got married to her own daughter, witnessed enough to document it and submit it to Dyer's board, the tale of the two lone accusers immediately crumbled. This wasn't a simple case of resentment or animosity between relatives. That implied that inside the Lamb circle, there were several witnesses. One of Dyer's most potent weapons was also undermined by the letter. The storyline that Pete had been cleared since the probe was temporarily halted. The network presented it to the public as proof of his innocence, going so far as to suggest that God had intervened on his behalf. Not everyone in the family believed Pete was innocent, though, and JW's story proved it. The fact that there were valid grounds to be worried was the only takeaway. Those who had bought into the official narrative were shocked and outraged when word of the letter spread, even within small circles. When Joni stood before her audience and said there was no evidence, many wondered why she would do so when someone in her own family had written something so grave. There was no nitpicking involved. The issue here was not divergent views on the significance of evidence. Here we had an obvious inconsistency. The son-in-law of hers explaining in great detail how he had seen enough to suspect wrongdoing. It wasn't merely the contents of JW's letter that were powerful, but its originator as well. It was always possible to write off outsiders as prejudiced or ignorant. Jonathan Weiss, however, was not an outsider. To him, he was like an extended family. He shared a house with everyone else and had been in the same rooms, at the same activities. The premise that the claims were merely the product of angry relatives was dismantled by his story. Because of this, the entire plot became more convoluted, confusing, and difficult to explain away. The letter was never turned over to the police, even though it contained important information. The entire consequences of that ruling was never realized by the legal system, whether due to fear, allegiance, or some other reason. However, its very presence altered the course of events in the arena of public sentiment. It revealed that there were deep-seated misgivings inside the Dyer family, underneath the surface of their confident smiles and united front. When news of that nature spreads, even broken into pieces, it cannot be returned to its original container. JW's letter had more than simply words on a page. Because of this, The first irrefutable evidence that Joni's account was incomplete emerged. For a lot of people, that was when everything started to come apart in the story. A simple anecdote was conveyed to the public for months. All of the Lambs were now one. Only her son Jonathan and his wife Susie have accused Pete of any misconduct, according to Joni Lamb's interviews and broadcasts. In her words, they were the isolated critics, implying that their charges sprang from interpersonal conflicts, misconceptions, or perhaps a desire to damage the ministry. For an extended period, the story was effective because it was neat and controlled. Those who had faith in Joni assumed the family was united. Perhaps it was all in the mind of those two individuals. However, things were considerably more problematic behind closed doors. Worried about Pete's actions were at least two of Joni's 3 children and their spouses. Ruth Lamb, Rebecca, Jonathan Weiss, the daughter of Joni, and her husband were among them. Neither of them was an observer. What they had witnessed in the beginning left a profound impression on them. They reportedly assured Jonathan and Susie face-to-face that they would support them no matter what. The case, even if it ended up in court. This was no ordinary act of compassion. If legal action were to be required, the potential of genuine popular backing was there. It utterly discredits the United Front reputation that Rebecca and JW first adopted such a firm stance. Standing together would indicate that all parties are in agreement, but evidently they weren't. At least 4 relatives found Pete's actions disturbing enough to voice their concerns. Not to mention that this wasn't family lore. These individuals were part of the inner circle, intimately related, to have been present for those very occasions. How, therefore, was this fact buried? Quietness is an important factor. Rebecca and JW's vocal worry gradually subsided. What they had seen was no longer spoken in public. A copy of JW's letter was sought by the police, however. Refused to provide over the letter that detailed the inappropriate behavior that he had personally witnessed. Looking at it from the outside, it appeared like a total 180. They were prepared to join Jonathan and Susie, standing shoulder to shoulder, at one point. Subsequently, they began to withdraw, remaining silent. And putting the whole weight on the 2 individuals who were already stereotyped as troublemakers. It is unclear to anyone outside of the tight group what caused that change. Why did they decide to go public? Was it because of pressure from family, the burden of safeguarding Dyer's reputation, concerns about their relationships, income, or their future in serving in the ministry? It is possible that any of those things had an effect. Their mutiny undoubtedly bolstered the official story. They let the story of the only 2 accusers continue in the public glare by remaining silent, despite the fact that they were once. Who are bringing charges? The erosion of trust starts at this chasm between public and private realities. Spinning is expected in business and politics. However, standards are more stringent when it concerns a Christian ministry. Those in favor have faith that they are being informed accurately, particularly when it concerns matters of grave concern like safeguarding a child. The revelation that key family members' opinions were omitted from the official narrative hits them like a ton of bricks. The pollution is just as harmful as telling the truth. Both the family dynamic and the investigation were affected by the change from vocal support to silence. An essential piece of evidence never made it into the record since the police never had JW's letter. That bolstered Dyer's case that there was no proof that Pete is guilty. Remaining silent in this matter was not impartial. It played a significant role in sustaining Joni's narrative that she wanted the public to believe. And that's where the problem lies. You can't trust the United Front. For the illusion to remain intact, some individuals had to remain silent and specific information had to remain concealed. Disagreements, personal matters, and even contradictory written remarks occurred behind the scenes. In the spotlight, a tidy, comforting tale took their place, and all the complications vanished. This is what is left after the PR jargon is removed. There was a lack of genuine familial unity. Disagreements arose not only because of divergent viewpoints, but also because some members chose to keep quiet in order to safeguard the ministry's reputation. Have observed. When that information leaked, it made it hard to believe Joni's United family claims without wondering what else had been changed or removed to make it look better. The difference between public and private sentiment is more than just a minor point. That's the key distinction between openness and command. Even within families, unity can occasionally be merely a show. The tale that chasm conveys is one of pressure, quiet, and the unpleasant truth. Starting when Dyer's leadership seems hell-bent on manipulating public perception of the situation when allegations against Pete arose. The network wasted no time portraying the brief halt in the inquiry as evidence of Pete's innocence after the police temporarily halted it. They released well-crafted comments to the public. Sure and definitive. Their word was that Pete had been completely cooperative with the authorities. He had complied with all requests and directions, and neither physical nor testimonial evidence linked him to any misconduct. They framed it as if it were a triumph, as if the public was made to believe that Pete had been vindicated and the truth had triumphed because the case had been put on hold, and the fact was completely different. The case was put on hold for exactly one reason, according to the head detective. The accusation-centered minor in question was feeling emotionally weak and finding it difficult to discuss what transpired. It's done. It wasn't due to a lack of evidence. This was not due to the fact that the claims were proven false. The reason behind this was the potential harm that could result from pressuring the kid to testify at that moment. Actually, the investigator made it quite obvious that this did not absolve Pete of blame. It would be possible to renew the probe whenever new information became available. Here is where the deception becomes crystal clear. For the purposes of the law, the case is just paused. Although this does not constitute an exoneration or even a closed case, Dyer felt that a pause was sufficient to construct a story. They managed to transform the pause into something positive, maybe even divine, by omitting the explanation behind it. From several public remarks, it was subtly but clearly implied that God had intervened on Pete's behalf, restoring his reputation. This framing was impactful for viewers who believed in Dyer and held Joni Lamb in high esteem. They were more than reassured. As a result, the notion that the claims have never had any basis. The issue is that this type of message accomplishes more than merely painting a positive picture of a challenging circumstance. It alters people's perceptions of reality. Those who listened to the official narrative were led to assume that the matter was already closed. No one informed them about the child's mental condition, the remarks made by the investigators, or the possibility of resuming the assessment. Not having that information allowed them to simply label critics as troublemakers or outright liars. The fact that Jonathan and Susie were denigrated because of the pause is what makes it even more disturbing. Dyer hinged on the premise that the pair had fabricated accusations due to the inactivity of the probe. It would indicate that there was nothing to investigate if the cops weren't making any progress. That was the sold message. For very some time, it was effective. The actual scenario's complexity. That Pete's release was overshadowed by the fact that a devastated youngster was not yet prepared to testify. The weight of what was withheld also needs to be considered. In their denial of evidence, Dyer failed to note the presence of JW's letter, which provided a first-hand account from even Joni's own son-in-law describing improper conduct that he had observed firsthand. There is no formal record of that letter because it never reached the police. Dyer may maintain that Pete was innocent in the absence of it. When the inquiry stalled, it became a shield, which they displayed if anyone dared to question them. However, that kind of protection is only effective if onlookers refrain from getting too close. That barrier started to crumble when the truth about the weight emerged, revealing that it was unrelated to Pete's clearance. Those who had put their faith in the network felt duped. They discovered that there was a deliberate effort to conceal the huge gap between the case being on hold and the case being over. The way Dyer framed the break wasn't merely an astute public relations strategy, though. To keep people's confidence and shield their reputation, they used this tactic on purpose. It was effective for a time because it appealed to people's tendency to think highly of someone they look up to. However, its manipulationist nature becomes apparent once its intended function is grasped. It substituted a more pleasant fabrication for the harsh reality that the lawsuit could not proceed due to a child's trauma. When they found out, a lot of people started to doubt everything they had been told before. When people don't say anything, it's usually more than that. Usually an option, a tactic, and even a defense in certain situations. One of the best ways to keep one's influence, protect one's reputation, and control the narrative during the Daystar affair was to remain silent. There was almost no quiet at the outset. It wasn't just Jonathan and Susie Lamb who were troubled when they accused Pete, a close relative, of acting inappropriately toward their little daughter. Supposedly, Rebecca Lamb and Jonathan Weiss had witnessed enough to be worried. Those in the know say they were rather forthright in telling Jonathan and Susie that they would defend their interests in court. An early demonstration of support was significant. It indicated that the charges weren't limited to a single couple. It implied that there were several family members who had witnessed the same thing, providing more evidence. Problematic conduct. That assurance, though, and that eagerness to talk, started to wane as time went on. No one in the general public witnessed it. There was a noticeable change, nevertheless, among the family. Before, Rebecca and JW were very vocal about what they had witnessed, till it becomes distinctly silent. A comprehensive first-hand description of Pete's conduct. JW's letter was demanded by the police, but he and his attorney refused to give it over. This document wasn't ordinary. The author was a member of the Lamb family, someone who had been present and seen conduct that went beyond what was considered acceptable. However, material was withheld from investigators rather than provided. Because of just one choice, the case's course was altered. Because the letter isn't part of the record, Dyer could retain, asserting that no proof existed. How could someone move from being vocal to keeping something so crucial to themselves? Influence becomes useful in such a situation. There is more to Dyer than meets the eye. A powerful Christian media conglomerate with close relationships to pastors, elected officials, and prominent contributors. Speaking out against the wrong person in that kind of setting isn't only uncomfortable, it may have a life-altering effect. It has the potential to ruin your career, bank account, personal connections, and public image. Many mistakenly believe that a person may be silenced by simply instructing them to stop talking. However, the pressure is actually less obvious in practice. It's when coworkers you've worked with before start acting distant. It's like being unexpectedly left out of gatherings. It's the realization that if you make a single mistake, you can find yourself cut off from a powerful circle. Being quiet in these kinds of situations has two benefits. It prevents the accused from facing additional investigation and prevents the institution from dealing with unpleasant and damaging realities. Furthermore, in cases where the institution is connected to the family's financial stability, reputation, and religious affiliation, there is an immense temptation to contain things. Dyer found it much easier to control the story once Rebecca and JW stopped speaking. Leadership could downplay the situation as an inflated family quarrel or a personal vendetta if Jonathan and Susie were the only ones making public complaints. The entire framework falls apart as soon as more family members' perspectives are heard. The price that Jonathan and Susie paid for their refusal to remain silent was harsh and swift. Many of their personal relationships, as well as their income and ministry positions, were severed. Among the many accusations leveled against them were attempts to demolish the ministry and betrayal of their own families. Those who chose to remain silent were able to escape that consequence. Their positions, clout, and reputation in the community remained intact. It may appear that they prevailed by retaining quiet. However, remaining silent has its own price. It's the unending burden of knowing you should have spoken out when something was wrong but didn't. Influence does more than merely silence those who speak up. It influences the tale that ends up being told. Dyer's official remarks were articulate, assured, and comforting. They painted a picture of an attack by vengeful relatives, that the accusations were without merit, and that the delay in the inquiry proved Pete's innocence. When JW's letter is not in the possession of law enforcement, that framing was not contested. Those who had faith in the ministry's judgment had no grounds to doubt it, while those who dared to raise doubts were easily brushed aside as being disruptive. Here is where the danger of influence sets in. It has the ability to warp reality and safeguard persons at the same time. Trust is irreparably damaged when a group that professes to be an advocate for truth instead utilizes its authority to control the facts. But speaking up is next to impossible in that kind of setting. Though not frequently stated directly, the danger is always felt. You risk losing what you've worked for if you speak. Because those who were previously prepared to speak up remained silent, the official narrative around the Daystar case persisted for far longer than it ought to have. That way, no one knew what was going on, and it seemed like the family was pulling together in taking Pete's side. Anyone else who may have been considering coming forward might have also gotten a message from it. Doing so will leave you all by yourself. It's in this way that influence can endure, by means of both direct authority and the dread of loss. What is supplied by that power? Unfortunately, there is a cost to remaining silent, even though it may seem like the better option at the time. When the truth finally comes out, the silent will have to face the consequences of their actions in keeping it hidden. I will always be aware of that. The ethical burden is particularly great when allegations involve potential harm to a kid. When you shield someone or something from harm, you may be enabling it to continue unabated. In this case, the price of being silent wasn't borne solely by Jonathan and Susie. The fallout from expressing oneself. Everyone who had a right to know the truth, including the innocent child at the center, paid the price. Make sure she was protected, give her voice a chance, and give her justice. On the contrary, the brand could be more easily protected due to influence. Plus, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to change one's mind after making a decision. A cautionary tale about the perilous combination of quiet and influence, the Daystar narrative serves as a timely reminder. Influence makes being silent alluring, if not essential, for one's very existence. Being quiet, in turn, safeguards and fortifies that impact. This loop can continue for a long time before someone figures out the reality. When it does, the silence parties are compelled to answer the same question. Weigh the cost of lying against the benefit of maintaining the reputation.